African leaders meeting at a two-day summit in Addis Ababa have adopted a resolution that describes slavery, deportation and colonization as genocide and crimes against the people of Africa.
Let me ask you something real quick. If the most powerful nations in Europe stood up today and admitted that their darkest historical chapters were not just crimes, but the systematic, intentional destruction of an entire people, do you think that would make headlines? Do you think the global media would be running 24-hour coverage? Of course they would. The whole planet would stop. Now, the entire African continent, 55 sovereign nations representing 1.4 billion people, just stood up in Addis Ababa and declared that centuries of colonial extraction and forced deportation were not just unfortunate history. They were the ultimate crime against humanity, a targeted erasure. And the Western media? Crickets! A footnote. That silence tells you everything you need to know about whose history the international system considers worthy of recognition. But today, right here, the story gets told properly. February 14th and 15th, 2026, heads of state from across the continent converged on Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for the 39th Ordinary Session of the African Union Assembly. 55 nations, one table. And for the first time in the history of this institution, something landed on that table that wasn't just rhetoric. It was a legal and political reckoning. The resolution adopted by consensus at this summit formally describes the transatlantic slave trade, the deportation of African peoples, and colonialism as, and I want you to hear these words carefully, genocide and crimes against the people of Africa. Not unfortunate historical events, not complex legacies, not different times, different values, genocide, full stop. AU Commission Chairman Mahmoud Youssouf stood before the Assembly and said it plainly. The conference recognizes colonization as a crime against humanity. That's very important. And he is right. That is very important. Because what happened to African people was not a misunderstanding. It was not commerce gone wrong. It was the systematic destruction of civilizations, cultures, populations, and futures. That is the textbook definition of genocide. And the African Union just put that definition where it belongs, in a formal political and legal framework. But let's go deeper. Because what makes this moment truly significant is not just what was said, it's what it signals about where Africa is heading. The word genocide carries enormous legal weight under international law. The 1948 UN Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Now think about what the transatlantic slave trade actually was. An estimated 12 to 15 million African people violently uprooted from their homelands, families shattered, languages suppressed, religions criminalized, names erased, entire kingdoms destabilized, and then colonialism that followed, the partitioning of the continent by foreign powers at the Berlin Conference of 1884, where African people were not even invited to discuss the fate of their own land. If that is not the destruction of peoples, in whole and in part, then the word genocide means nothing. The AU didn't just adopt a symbolic resolution. Member states committed to pursuing international recognition of this framing. Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama, who led much of this initiative and was elected first vice chairperson of the AU for 2026, made clear that the continent is going on a diplomatic offensive. Starting February 20th, which is literally today, Ghana begins intensive engagements in New York with CARICOM and the Group of 77, building a coalition before formal consultations on the resolution text run through March. This is not a press conference, this is strategy. And it comes with a timeline. The AU has committed to a 2026 to 2035 decade of reparatory justice. This is a 10-year political project, not a moment, a movement. Now here is something that deserves to be burned into memory. November 30th has officially been designated as the African Day of Tribute to African martyrs and victims of the transatlantic slave trade, colonization, and apartheid. Think about what that means culturally and spiritually. Every November 30th, Africa pauses. Africa remembers. Africa names its dead, not as victims to be pitied, but as martyrs, people who resisted, who survived, who built worlds under conditions designed to destroy them. There is enormous power in naming. There is enormous power in a day that belongs to Africa's grief and Africa's defiance, on Africa's terms, not on anyone else's schedule or comfort. This is not about wallowing in the past. This is about building an identity anchored in historical truth. Peoples who know their history are peoples who cannot be easily manipulated. Peoples who have named their wounds are peoples who understand why those wounds must be healed, and who heals them, and how. The summit also doubled down on something that reveals the moral clarity of the African position on global justice. AU Commission Chairman Mahmoud Ali Youssouf explicitly addressed the ongoing crisis in the Middle East, calling for an immediate end to the systemic destruction of the Palestinian population. Now, some people will ask, what does that region have to do with Africa? The answer is ideological consistency. African populations know what it looks like when people are systematically displaced from their ancestral lands. They know what it looks like when the international community frames structural violence as security operations. A continent that just formally identified its own historical erasure cannot look away from another population facing the exact same logic of displacement. To do so would be a betrayal of the very legal framework this AU resolution is built on. Justice is not selective. Either human dignity is universal or it means nothing. Now, let's talk honestly, because the audience watching this channel deserves honesty, not just celebration. Resolutions are not reparations. Words adopted in Addis Ababa are not money transferred to Haiti, or land returned to the Herero people in Namibia, or looted artifacts shipped back from European museums. A piece of paper, however powerfully worded, does not rebuild what was taken over centuries. The challenge, and every serious person watching knows this, is translation. How does this resolution become binding legal frameworks? How does this diplomatic offensive actually move the United Nations, which is itself a product of the post-colonial order and has its own structural interests in maintaining the status quo? How do you get the countries that benefited most from slavery and colonialism to sit at a table and agree to any real accountability? The European nations that extracted untold wealth from African labor and resources are not waiting eagerly for a reparations bill. The UK has already made clear multiple times that it considers reparations a non-starter. France is not exactly rushing to account for the debt it forced Haiti to pay for daring to be free. Germany has moved on the Herero genocide with some acknowledgement, but called it something other than genocide in formal legal terms to avoid compensation obligations. The international system was not built to serve Africa. It was built alongside the exploitation of Africa. Reform from within that system requires either extraordinary unity and pressure or building parallel power structures that shift the terms entirely. This is why the AU's push to bring this resolution to the international level matters. But it cannot stop at diplomacy. The reparations agenda has to connect to debt restructuring, to the repatriation of looted wealth, to climate financing, to the reform of the UN Security Council, which, as UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres himself admitted at this very summit, still has no permanent African seats. He said it plainly. This is 2026, not 1946. Whenever decisions about Africa and the world are on the table, Africa must be at the table. Even the UN chief is saying what Pan-Africanists have been saying for decades. Here is the deeper significance of what happened in Addis Ababa and why it matters beyond the headlines. For generations, the framework around slavery and colonialism has been controlled by those who committed those crimes. They named it, they contextualized it, they decided what language was acceptable to describe it, and they determined what, if any, accountability was appropriate. They called slavery a peculiar institution. They called colonialism a civilizing mission. They called the theft of an entire continent's resources development. African people have always known the truth. Scholars, writers, freedom fighters, from Amilcar Cabral to Walter Rodney to Patrice Lumumba to Wangari Maathai, have documented and testified to the truth for over a century. But documentation and testimony from the oppressed within an international system controlled by the oppressor has always been easy to dismiss. This resolution changes the architecture. Now it is African heads of state, informal assembly, by consensus, defining the terms. Colonialism is a crime against humanity. Slavery is genocide. That is now the official continental position, backed by 55 sovereign nations. Anyone who wants to engage Africa on questions of history, justice, or international law now has to reckon with that. And there is something else. The move from symbolic recognition to actual legal and institutional frameworks, setting up expert mechanisms, building diplomatic coalitions, establishing a reparatory justice decade, signals a shift in how the continent is approaching power, not waiting for validation, not asking for permission to name its own history, building the machinery to pursue accountability on African terms through African-led processes with African-constructed legal arguments. That is sovereign action. That is what it looks like when a continent stops apologizing for existing and starts demanding what is owed. So, where does this go from here? Ghana leads the diplomatic charge at the United Nations starting today. CARICOM, the Caribbean nations whose populations are largely descended from enslaved Africans, is already aligned. The group of 77 developing nations represents the global majority that has everything to gain from reshaping the international justice framework. The resistance will be fierce. The powerful rarely yield without pressure, but the significance of this moment should not be underestimated, because every movement that eventually won started with someone naming the truth out loud and refusing to be silenced. November 30th is now a day on the African calendar. Mark it. Remember it. Teach it to the next generation, because the children who grow up knowing that their ancestors were not just slaves, but people who were targeted by genocide and who survived it, those children will understand their own dignity in ways that no colonial education system ever allowed. The African Union just looked at 400 years of history and said, this was a crime. The world will acknowledge it, and the accounting will come. The question is not whether the world is ready. The question is whether Africa is organized enough, unified enough, and relentless enough to make the world reckon with it anyway. From the evidence of Addis Ababa 2026, the answer is starting to look like yes. Stay locked in, subscribe, share this with somebody who needs to hear it. And until next time, know your history, protect your sovereignty, and trust no narrative that doesn't put African voices first.